We've been looking at, for the past several weeks, some unexpected things that Jesus said and some unexpected things that Jesus did. Last week, looking particularly at what he said about how we're supposed to interact with our enemies, which on a day like today, with it being remembering 9/11, 21 years ago, it's a great day to remind ourselves, how did Jesus tell us to interact and to respond to our enemies? I know that we still struggle with what that looks like. There's a lot of different interpretations as to what he meant when he said that and what we should physically or verbally do. But I encourage us to always look and see what did he have to say about this, because many times in our lives we realize that what he said was completely unexpected for them to hear or see in that day, and 2,000 years later, it still surprises us when we look back and we see what it is that he said and what it is that he did. And that's why we spend some time doing this. But I wonder this morning what you would do if Jesus walked in here today and he stood in front of all of you and he said, "You will never meet in this building again in your life." In fact, this built, so 14, 15-ish years ago, the building that was standing here ceased to be standing here. This building right here, about 14, 15-ish years old, because the previous one caught fire. But what if Jesus said, hey, it's going to be gone, and you're not going to rebuild it? You're not going to meet there anymore. What would happen to your worship if that were to happen? What would happen to your walk with God if he were to say, you will not come here again? Because he said something like that to his followers at one point, and trust me, well, hopefully you trust me, it surprised them. It was an unexpected thing for them to hear. They were walking out of the temple, which was their version of what we meet in now. They were walking out of the temple, and they kind of turn around and they go, Jesus, look at this amazing structure. And Jesus' response looked like this in Mark chapter 13. He says, so as he was going to the temple complex, one of his disciples said to him, "Teacher, look, what massive stones, what impressive buildings." And Jesus' response was, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here on another that will not be thrown down. Not a single brick is going to remain in the way that you see it. You see an impressive building, it's about to be gone." The center for their worship was about to be finished. We can read the same story in Matthew chapter 24 as Jesus left and was going out of the temple complex. His disciples came up and called his attention to the temple buildings. And then he replied to them, "Don't you see all these things? I assure you, not one stone will be left here on another that will not be thrown down." That story is told in 2 of the 4 gospel accounts, which means we should probably pay attention to it. If it's told once, we should definitely still pay attention. If it's told twice, don't miss this. If it's one of those that's told in all 4 and we still miss it, that might say more about us than anything else. But we'll leave that one for where it is this morning too. Jesus tells them, hey, this place, and we're going to talk a little bit about the place, this place that you see, these beautiful buildings that you put all of this emphasis in, they're going to be gone, finished, torn down. Now, as we look back in history, we know that conquerors came in, they wiped out the temple, it's completely gone. Jerusalem, you didn't have the temple anymore. We see that his words came true. We also see some of the complications that it caused because so much was tied to that location and that building. This kind of builds off of something that Jesus had said earlier in a conversation that he had had, in a story that we often refer to as the woman at the well, or his conversation with the Samaritan woman. They're talking about, several different things. He's proved to her that he is who he says he is. She's looking at him. She's like, "You must be a prophet." And then she responds after this whole conversation that they have together, and I don't have all of the story up there for you. But he's told her, go get your husband. He's gone through that part. She's like, I don't have a husband. He's like, you're right. You've had 5 of them, and the one you're currently living with, he's not even your husband. So he's like, yep, I am who I say I am. I know these things, and I know this about a Samaritan woman, which is extra important for them because Jewish people, they didn't care about Samaritan people. So there was no reason for him to know that she had been with 5 husbands and was now living with another man who was not her husband. And so she looks at him and she says, sir, you must be a prophet. So tell me, why is it that you Jews insist that Jerusalem is the only place of worship, while we Samaritans claim it is here at Mount Gerizim where our ancestors worshiped? This is 2,000 years ago. She looks at him and she says, why is it that you insist it has to be there, but we insist it has to be here? Fast forward 2,000 years to where we stand today. Have any of you ever heard a conversation pretty similar to this one? Why is it that you insist that your place that you go on Sunday morning has it figured out, but the place that I go doesn't? A little backstory, I grew up in the Church of God. I'd been in it all my life. Church of God, Anderson, Indiana. I learned that you always clarify it is Church of God, Anderson, Indiana, because Church of God, Cleveland is not the same as Church of God, Anderson. And there's actually another one in there too. I just can't remember where it is. But those are the two. If you go down south and you say Church of God, you are very clear to say Church of God Anderson because you don't want to be lumped in with the snake-handling Church of God Cleveland people. Now, we boil it all down. Do they handle snakes? And for some reason, that's the only thing we talk about. It's not exactly what it sounds like, but we'll leave that one there this morning too. Church of God, Anderson, Indiana. That's where I grew up my entire life. Both of my grandpas were pastors in the Church of God for 50 plus years. And I grew up with the belief, not because of what my grandparents told me, not even so much because of what my church, my pastor, my leaders within the church, what they taught me, but because of just things that some unspoken things that I picked up on. I grew up with the belief that to marry anybody who wasn't in the Church of God Anderson was the definition of being unequally yoked. And Jesus said, do not be unequally yoked. Now, as I've gotten older, I've realized the Church of God didn't exist at that point in the way that we think of the Church of God. He wasn't talking about that at all. But I was so convinced that the Catholics and the Baptists and the Methodists and the Presbyterians and the Pentecostals, and I could go on and on and on because there's about 10,000 denominations around the world today, very united church. But I could go on and on and on. I believe that all the other 9,999, they didn't have it figured out. But the Church of God, Anderson, Indiana, had it figured out. D.S. Warner and his group of friends that went around, they figured it out. Now again, I've grown up a little bit since then. I've learned a little bit since then. But that's a lot bit the mentality that they were walking around with when the Samaritan woman looks at Jesus and says, you Jews say that you have to worship God at the temple in Jerusalem, but we say that you have to worship God here on Mount Gerizim. And Jesus' response is, believe me, dear woman, the time is coming when it will no longer matter whether you worship the Father on this mountain or in Jerusalem. You Samaritans know very little about the one you worship, while we Jews know all about him. Now, Jesus isn't saying this cocky sounding, although if you decide to read into it, it can sound that way. It's not his intent. We can read a lot of our personality into the words of Jesus, which is a very dangerous thing to do. But there were a lot of Jewish people who were walking around going, we've got this all figured out. We are the chosen people. You Samaritans, you don't know what's going on. Now bring that to 2,000 years later, and it sounds like a lot of conversations that we still have today. We've got this all figured out. You people who don't come into this building on Sunday morning, you've got a long ways to go. You need to figure things out. But then Jesus looks at her and says, for salvation comes through the Jews, but the time is coming. Indeed, it's here now, when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. The Father is looking for those who will worship him that way. For God is spirit, so those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. Jesus looks at this woman, and he has a conversation later on with his disciples. And in both of these conversations, he says, look, it's not about your tradition. It's not about these things that you have made this all about. It's not about the location. It's not about what, bring this into our world today, what the Sunday morning looks like. If you look at Jewish history and you look at the history of the temple, King David was actually the one who came up with the idea of building this temple for God. And God's first response was, I don't want it. I'm a God who roams. I've lived in a tent. I'm perfectly fine with it. I can go where I want. You're not going to confine me to a place. But God relents, and he allows David's son, Solomon, to build this temple. And all of a sudden, these Israelite people who had viewed God as a God who was constantly on the move, a God who, when that pillar of fire or that pillar of cloud, when it began to move, they went with it. All of a sudden, they came up with this idea of God belongs here. God belongs in this box. In order for us to worship God, we have to come to this temple. In order for us to bring any kind of sacrifice to him, we have to come to this temple and this place and trust this person to do this thing. That's how we worship God. This is how it works. This is our tradition. This is our location. And if you look through the Old Testament and you read the stories of the Israelite people, we realize it doesn't work. When you confine God to this box, this location, this, the beautiful temple that it was, when you confine him there, then what you begin to think is that he's not everywhere else that you go. That there is this supernatural power of this one spot. And if I can get to that one spot, then I can be filled with the Holy Spirit. Then I can be filled with God. But I can also walk out the door and I can leave him there until I come back next time. Again, bring that to today. We see it all the time. I'm guilty of it. That we have this different mentality when we're in this building, or any building. It's not just about this building. Please let me be clear. It is not just about the church sitting at 4930 South DeBoard Road in, I almost said Wheatland because my house is in Wheatland, even though it's across the parking lot, in Monroe City, Indiana. I'm talking about church buildings in general. We begin to, when we walk in here, well, now I'm ready to allow my heart to worship. And then we walk out of here, now I'm ready to live my life. Now I've got to go into the real world where things actually happen. Jesus continued in his time to say some things that would have made us very uncomfortable and would have definitely made them very uncomfortable. In Mark chapter 7, in verse 6 and 7, he says, "These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far away. Their worship is a farce, for they replace God's commands with their own man-made teachings." Or I think we could sub a word in there, and I try to be very careful about subbing words, but they replace God's commands with their own traditions. The things that they've latched onto over the years, the things that they've decided, this is how this looks. You go all the way back to the psalmist in Psalm 51 in verse 16, Jesus says this, the psalmist says this, "You do not desire a sacrifice, or I would offer one. You don't want a burnt offering." We don't burn offerings anymore. We don't, and I'm really thankful for this, we don't come in here and release the blood of the bull or anything like that. That's what Jesus' death on the cross was for. He was the final sacrifice. But how many times do we walk in here and we still have those things that we're like, this has to happen in order for me to be able to worship God? We have our traditions that we hang on to. And Please hear me now. This is not a message about let go of the old songs. It's none of that. That's not what we're talking about this morning. It's not about let go of things that we used to do. It's not that either. We're going to get to what this is about if you'll hang with me. You don't desire a sacrifice like the Israelite people were doing for years and years and years and forgetting what it was about. Instead, the sacrifice you desire is a broken spirit. You will not reject a broken and repentant heart, O God. When was the last time you walked in here, and maybe it was today, and that's awesome. I'm not saying that this isn't a regular occurrence, but when was the last time you walked in here or you walked into the presence of God, you acknowledged the presence of God with a broken spirit saying, God, you are the only one that I can rely on in this moment. Not as in like nobody else is around here for me, but you are the only one who is powerful enough. You are the only one who is big enough. You are the only one that I can truly lean on. You are the only one that will never be wrong. You are the only one. God, I am not worthy of being in your presence, but because of what you've done, I can come here right now. When was the last time that you did that? Hopefully recently. Hopefully maybe within the past 5 minutes. But if not, when was it? God doesn't desire the sacrifice of our traditional way of doing things. What God desires is our heart. As we look at the words that Jesus said to his followers, that Jesus said to that woman at the well, we begin to see that a lot of the things that we make worship all about. In fact, I'm very careful. That doesn't mean I don't slip up sometimes on this, but I try to be very careful not to say that was a great time of worship or we're going to come together and worship, because so often that's what we refer to the music time as. The music time is the worship time. But what I try to be very clear about is worshiping through song, because it clarifies that that was the method. That was not the act of worship. That was the method that I was using to express my worship. It was through song. It can be worship through prayer. It can be worship through serving. It can be worship through fill in the blank. It can be worship through so many different things. We typically come together and we worship through song. But what would happen if Jesus came in here and he said, hey, I don't want your music. I don't want your songs. I don't want you to sing that. Because I don't buy it. Not because singing is bad, but because I don't buy that that's really where your heart is right now. That song that we sang there at the end, that was actually a song that they introduced to the students at IYC this year, International Youth Convention down in Texas. And as they got up and they introduced that song with, a couple thousand teenagers in the room, they started it off by singing the choruses of several hymns. And when I say hymns, I mean the ones that, many of you might have grown up with if you're of an older generation than I am. A hymn can be so much more than that, but I'm talking about the songs that were sung in churches in the generation previous to my generation. Because He Lives, Old Rugged Cross, Amazing Grace, some of those songs. They started off by and they had some fun with it, but not making fun of them, not that kind of fun, but they had some fun singing these songs, and we heard the voices of these thousands of students singing Jesus Paid It All, and the voices of these thousands of students singing Blessed Assurance. And then they start into this new song, which starts off with the words, I remember those melodies, those words we sang when I first believed. Songs of redemption, stories of hope. This is my song. And I thought it was so beautiful the way that they connected those older songs to a young generation and explaining even a little bit. Like there was some teaching going on in this moment of, hey, we understand that these songs, they don't connect with you the way that they do with your parents or your grandparents. We acknowledge that. The words are still great, but we get it. But then they walk through here's why it connects with your parents and your grandparents. Because for many of them, on the day that they began to walk with Jesus, on the day that they decided, this is the one that I believe, this is the one that I'm going to trust, this is the one that I'm going to give my life to, on the day that they did that, these were the songs that were being sung. And music has a way of connecting with our soul in a way that many other things can't. I won't say who said it this week, but I heard the phrase of, that old stuff is way better than this new stuff. That person was actually talking about country music, not worship music. Just throwing that out there. It was a funny moment. It was great. But we connect to certain things, and then sometimes we begin to think that that's the only way to do it. Because that's what I connect with. My generation, standing in here. We were 90s, early 2000s people. Our generation of worship music, we don't connect to very well because it wasn't very good. In my opinion, and the opinion of a lot of my generation. We were the generation of, let's come out here and sing the same line for 20 minutes. At least that's how my dad told me it was. You remember the songs, I could sing of your love forever. Let's sing that line again. I could sing of your love forever. And I don't mean to make fun of a song, but we're going to sing that again. I could sing of your love. And it went on and on and on. And we began to hear from an older generation, all your songs do is sing the same thing over and over and over again. And eventually I grew up and I realized they're right. We just sing the same line. And you're hearing a little bit of me coming out in this, and so I very much apologize. But I began to start wrestling with at what point do we realize that Jesus has it figured out what we're singing? That we could sing of his love forever. Maybe it's because we grew up in the generation of this is the song that never ends. Maybe it's because we grew up in that. I don't know. If I am offending you right now, I sincerely sort of apologize. But that's the generation that I grew up with. The thing is, even though as I got older, I realized I didn't even like that music. I love some of the newer stuff that's coming out. But as I grew up and I looked back, it's like, man, I don't even connect with the stuff that was being sung when I was in middle school and high school. But you know what I did do over it? I fought the older people over it. I dug in. I said, you're just being old-fashioned, and you're just trying to, this song has great lyrics to it for those 6 words that we sang over and over and over again. Those were a great 6 words. So we have a generation that's attached to what we refer to often as the hymns, and it's not the whole generation. We have to be careful with that too. We generalize a lot of these things, but we have this generation that's attached there, and then we have a generation that kind of grew up in the age of the music that we look back on and don't sing anymore. And now we have a new generation with a new generation of music. And it quickly becomes this is the style of music that has to be sung. And many times, if we're honest, what it comes down to is this is the style of music that was playing when I gave my life to Christ. And obviously, if I could give my life to Christ to that music, everybody should be giving their life to Christ with that music playing in the background. They just need to figure it out. They just need to get where I'm at. And that's exactly where the Jewish people were at. If other people could just figure out that this is the only way to do this, and this is the only place to do this, and you have to do all of these things to do this, that's where they were. They didn't make it possible for the rest of the world to enter into a relationship with God. They rule them all out. And Jesus comes along and says, look, true worship has nothing to do with your location. It's not about the bricks, and it's not about the mountains. True worship has nothing to do with your location. Is it important to come here? Yes and no. It's not about coming here, it's about coming together. It's about meeting with one another. If you were the only person to walk into this building, you could just as easily worship God at home. But this is about coming together in this place. So it's not about the location. And true worship is not about the tradition. Because we can quickly get to the point, my generation, the younger generation, the older generation, we can quickly get to the point where we are latched onto the what instead of being latched onto the why. And Jesus told us, look, it's not about the tradition. I don't care about your sacrifices. Your worship is a farce. It's all fake. You're just coming out here and you're going through the motions, and I don't care about the motions. What I care about is what's in here when you do it. Because true worship comes from the core of who you are. True worship comes from deep down inside that says, I'm going to give everything that I have. I believe in this Savior who went to a cross, who died for me, who is the Son of God, who is equal with God. And I'm going to give my life to him, and I'm going to walk with his Spirit inside of me, and I'm going to allow that to flow out of me. I'm going to worship with that Spirit. And when we begin to do that, when we begin to tear down the necessity of a place and the necessity of a tradition, even communion that we do once a week in here can quickly become something that we forget what it's all about. When we start complaining about the taste of the bread, now, Kathy, the bread is delicious, don't get me wrong, but I've been places where we complain about the bread, or I came from a congregation where we had the little wafers that were like, I mean, to be real, they're disgusting. We would never eat them anywhere else. But when all we're doing is complaining about this little wafer or this stale bread, or how it's, the juice isn't enough to wash it down, have we forgotten about the why? Have we forgotten about what we're remembering? Now, I get it. We make comments about it. I think Jesus has a sense of humor. But there's a difference between making a comment and making a complaint. And you know deep down which one you're doing in the moment. If I'm making a comment or making a complaint. It could be communion. It could be prayer. It could be the songs. It could be you name it. It could be the stained glass windows. It could be so many things. When we forget the why, worship will become about location and tradition. And Jesus looked at his followers who were used to that, who had grown up being taught that, and he said, "You got it wrong." It was an unexpected thing for them to hear him so flippantly say, this building, this beautiful structure, it's going to be demolished. Not a single stone is going to sit on top of another one. And now I don't know for sure what his facial expressions were. I don't know for sure what his tone of voice was. But reading the words, he doesn't seem to care. He doesn't seem all that worked up about it. Because when David went to build it, he tried to tell David, I don't want it. Because you're going to end up making it all about this building. And I don't want it to be all about this building. He looked at a woman by a well and he said, it's not going to be about which city or which mountain you worship on. It's going to be about how and why you worship me. Next week, we're going to cross the corner. I mean, it's a long ways away. You might not want to park in our parking lot because you're going to get in an extra 50 steps if you do. But we're going to cross the, actually, go ahead, park in our parking lot, just so everyone knows I wasn't serious on that one. We're going to cross the corner, and we're going to go and we're going to join with other people who worship differently than we do, who sing different styles of songs than we do. We're going to hear from some other speakers who speak very differently than I do. And for some of you, you're going to be like, yep, that's why I'm going. And for others of you, you're going to be like, yep, that's why I come here, not there. But we're going to go over there, and we're going to have what is commonly referred to in this area as the community worship service. I can tell you where I come from on this is I've been pushing in our conversations about it. Are we pushing for unity in this? Or are we just coming together for a week and going through the motions of a tradition, acting like we like to be together for a week? And I've pushed, and I've got pushed back. And that's okay. That's part of having these discussions. That's part of seeking unity, is that people don't just automatically accept everything you say. That's called a dictatorship. But I've been pushing on that, and I'm going to push you this morning and for next week. Because from what I've been told, the history is, on community worship service Sunday morning, about 40% of this congregation shows up. The rest look at it as a Sunday off. Because I don't want to worship like that. I don't want to listen to those speakers. I don't want to sit in a different building. It's hot and it's loud. I don't want to do that. Now, I've never experienced it. Maybe all of those things are true. Maybe I'm going to walk out after next week and be like, oh, the 60% were right. But I don't think so. I can tell you right now, it's not the style of music that I turn on the radio. But it doesn't mean that I can't worship while I'm there. And it's probably not the style a lot of you turn on the radio, but that doesn't mean that you can't worship while you're there. And I can tell you that the speaking styles, they are different. But that doesn't mean there's not truth to be spoken while they speak. And that doesn't mean there's not value in people coming together that wouldn't normally come together. These are people that we see throughout the week, but now we have the opportunity to come with them on a Sunday morning. And so I'm laying it on pretty thick, and I realize that. Because I don't see, and again, maybe I'm going to walk out and be like, oh man, the 60% were right. I will stand up here and admit it to you if I walk out feeling that way. I realize that's a possibility. But I don't see how we could say it's not about tradition and location when we refuse to go when it's not in the location and with the tradition that we're used to. So I hope to see you all next week. I hope that we come together and we worship with other individuals who do things possibly very differently than we do them. And it's not to say that everyone can do whatever they want and everything's okay and yada, 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 all that stuff. I know all those arguments. But I think we're going to be pretty safe next week. I think we're going to have a great time of worship next week, and I hope to see you there. True worship comes from the core of who we are. And it doesn't matter where we are. It doesn't matter what we're doing. We can still focus on Him as the one that we are worshiping. When Jesus sat in that upper room, and as He was sharing the Passover meal that we refer to now as the Last Supper, He broke the bread, and He said, "This is my body, broken for you." And then they sat down, and they had a meal together. And over the course of that meal, I can only imagine what some of the things were that they talked about. Maybe they were having some of this discussion right now about the temptation that they were going to fall into of having everything be all about the place and all about their traditions. We see in Scripture that the early followers, that they wrestled with some of these things that 2,000 years later we still haven't figured out. They were wrestling with them then, they're wrestling with them now, but that doesn't mean we stop. So maybe that was part of their conversation. And then at the end of the meal, he picked up the wine again. And he says, this is a symbol of the new covenant. Which again, they didn't get at the time. We have the benefit of hindsight. This is the symbol of the new covenant, my blood poured out for you. When you drink this, remember me. Church, this morning we're going to drink juice. And it's just a teeny tiny little bit of juice. If you're thirsty from the bread earlier, this isn't going to help. But that's because it's not about the juice. It's about remembering the covenant that he agreed to make with us. And it's saying, I do remember that, and I do step into that covenant this morning. And then as we leave here today, we leave as new covenant people. Everywhere that we go, that our worship is not confined to this place or to a certain way of doing it, but that our worship comes and flows out of us in every location that we are. I'm not going to come back up, and the worship team isn't going to say anything at the end about drinking the juice. I'm going to invite you to come forward just like you did earlier. If you were in a place where you feel like this is what I'm supposed to do this morning, I want to join in or rejoin or continue in that covenant that Jesus laid out for me. I want to be a part of that. I'm going to invite you to come to receive the juice. You can hang out in your seats as we sing a last song, as we worship through song. Or you can step right out the back doors and you can take your worship into the community around us and begin the preparation for taking it into your jobs and your schools throughout the course of this week. God, we thank you for being who you are. We thank you for your blood being poured out for us, for your body being broken for us. And God, sometimes it's easier to think of worship being confined to a location or worship being confined to a certain way of doing things because, well, we can step into that type of a structure. But God, I think sometimes it's exactly that turns people away from you because they see us doing that and they don't see us worship you the rest of the week. So God, I pray this morning that as we receive this juice that symbolizes your blood poured out for us, that we would remember stepping into your covenant, your new covenant of being your people, not just on Sunday morning, but every single day of the week. We pray this in your name. Amen.